What if the reason you feel exhausted isn't life, isn't other people, but the constant pressure to fix yourself? Think about it. Every time something feels off, your first instinct is, I need to work on this. Be more confident. Be more focused. Be calmer. Be better. And at first it feels responsible, mature, productive. But here's the uncomfortable question nobody asks. What if that mindset is slowly turning you against yourself? What if every attempt to improve is actually a quiet message saying, you're not acceptable yet? And what if that message is the reason you never feel settled, no matter how much progress you make? Stay with that thought, because Carl Jung warned that the most dangerous mistakes don't look destructive at all. They look like self-improvement. Most people assume growth works like this. Find what's wrong. Fix on some tools. Move on. So you start monitoring yourself, your reactions, your habits, your tone, your productivity, your mindset. You turn your inner world into a project that's never finished. And strangely, the more aware you become, the worse you feel. Not because you're failing, but because there's always something new to correct. Carl Jung once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." And that line hits harder than it sounds, because acceptance doesn't mean giving up. It means dropping the fantasy that there's a version of you that deserves peace more than the one you are right now. Here's where things get interesting. Jung believed that when you try to eliminate parts of yourself instead of understanding them, you don't become stronger, you become divided. One part of you is trying to improve. Another part feels like a problem that needs to disappear. And when those two sides are constantly at war, something breaks, quietly. So in this video, we're not going to talk about how to fix yourself. We're going to ask a harder question. What if fixing yourself is the reason you feel more disconnected than ever? Because once you see this pattern, you can't unsee it. And everything about self-improvement starts to feel very different. So before we talk about what's actually happening beneath all this effort, we need to look at the reflex itself. Because most people don't choose to fix themselves. They react. Something feels uncomfortable, and the moment it does, your brain jumps in with a solution. Not curiosity, not understanding. Correction. And that reflex is where everything begins to go wrong. The fixing reflex shows up the moment something inside you feels out of place. You feel anxious, so you search for techniques to eliminate it. You feel unmotivated, so you label it as a discipline problem. You feel insecure, so you assume confidence is missing and needs to be built. Notice the pattern. Every feeling becomes a flaw. Every reaction becomes evidence that something in you is malfunctioning. And no one ever teaches you to question that assumption. Instead, you're rewarded for it. People praise you for working on yourself. Content tells you awareness is the same thing as progress. So you start scanning yourself constantly. After conversations, you replay what you said. During moments of discomfort, you ask how to optimize your response. When something goes wrong, you immediately look inward, not to understand, but to correct. Carl Jung once wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." But here's the twist most people miss. Making something conscious doesn't mean trying to get rid of it. Yet that's exactly what the fixing reflex does. It treats every uncomfortable part of you as an error to be patched, instead of a signal to be listened to. So instead of asking, "Why did this reaction happen?" you ask, How do I stop this from happening again? And over time, this creates a strange inner environment. One part of you is always watching, judging, evaluating, and another part of you is always on trial. That tension doesn't motivate you, it drains you. Because when your default response to yourself is correction, you're never actually present with what's happening. You're already trying to escape it. And that's the moment self-improvement quietly turns into self-rejection. And we haven't even reached the most damaging part yet. Now here's where things get uncomfortable. Because the fixing reflex doesn't just change what you do, it changes how you see yourself. And once that shift happens, self-improvement stops being a tool and quietly becomes an identity. At first, working on yourself feels empowering. You tell yourself you're being honest, self-aware, responsible. But slowly, something else slips in. You stop seeing your traits as temporary states and start treating them like permanent defects. You're not tired. You're lazy. You're not overwhelmed. You're weak. You're not uncertain. You're behind. And the goalposts keep moving. There's always a better version of you waiting in the future. More composed. More productive. More confident. So the present version of you becomes a problem to solve, not a person to understand. Carl Jung warned about this internal split. He said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." Because acceptance feels like failure when your identity is built on improvement. You start measuring your worth by distance, how far you are from who you think you should be. And every day you don't close that gap feels like proof that you're falling short. Here's how self-rejection sneaks in. You praise the idea of growth, but you criticize the starting point. You tell yourself motivation will come once you're better. Peace will come once you've fixed enough. So you live in a constant state of delay. You postpone rest. You postpone satisfaction. You postpone permission to be okay. Not because you hate yourself, but because you believe self-acceptance has to be earned. And that belief slowly rewires how you relate to yourself. Instead of asking, "What do I need right now?" you ask, "What's wrong with me?" Instead of listening, you diagnose. And the irony is this: the harder you try to reject the parts you don't like, the louder they become. Because what you push away doesn't disappear. It waits. And that's why so many people who are obsessed with growth feel increasingly disconnected from themselves. They're not becoming stronger. They're becoming divided. And once that division sets in, improvement stops feeling like progress and starts feeling like pressure. And once that division becomes normal, something else happens. Something most people never connect to self-improvement at all. You don't just feel pressured, you feel fragmented. When you're always trying to become someone better, you slowly stop being someone whole. Because improvement, when it's driven by rejection, creates categories inside you. There's the version of you that's acceptable, composed, productive, controlled. And then there's everything else. The irritation you quickly suppress. The hesitation you rush past. The ambition you downplay, because it doesn't fit the image you're trying to maintain. You don't explore these reactions. You manage them. And management sounds healthy, until you realize it's built on avoidance. Carl Jung explained this pattern clearly. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. What he meant is this: what you don't acknowledge doesn't stop influencing you. It just stops being visible. So patterns repeat. You keep ending up in the same emotional situations. You keep reacting in ways you promised yourself you'd outgrown. You keep feeling pulled in directions you don't fully understand. And instead of asking why, you double down on improvement. New rules, new systems, new versions of self-control. But the more rules you add, the less natural you feel. You start performing yourself instead of experiencing yourself. Conversations feel monitored. Decisions feel calculated. Rest feels undeserved. Because there's always another part of you waiting to be corrected. And here's the hidden cost no one talks about. When every reaction is filtered through self-improvement, you lose access to honest feedback. You don't feel what's actually happening. You feel what you think you should feel. So frustration turns into guilt. Curiosity turns into self-doubt. Discomfort turns into urgency to change. And over time, this creates emotional numbness. Not because you don't care, but because you're never allowed to simply register an experience without editing it. That's why constant improvement doesn't lead to clarity. It leads to exhaustion. Because you're carrying two roles at once. The one living the experience, and the one constantly supervising it. And eventually, that internal supervision becomes the loudest voice in the room. But this still isn't the core issue. The real problem appears when you realize who you're trying to become, and why that version never feels close enough. So now the question changes. If constant improvement is exhausting, and self-correction keeps splitting you in two, why is it still so hard to stop? Because you're not just chasing improvement anymore. You're chasing a version of yourself. At some point, self-improvement stops being about growth and becomes about replacement. You're no longer asking how to live more clearly. You're trying to become someone else entirely. A version of you who reacts better, decides faster, feels less conflicted. And this version always exists just ahead of where you are. When you make progress, the standard shifts. When you reach a goal, a new flaw appears. When you feel calm, you're told to be more disciplined. So relief never arrives. You tell yourself, once I reach that level, things will settle. But they don't. Because the idea of someone better is built on comparison, not reality. It's shaped by expectations you absorbed without questioning. Productivity standards, personality ideals, behavior you were told signals success. Carl Jung warned against this pursuit. He said, "Perfection belongs to the gods. The most we can hope for is completeness." But completeness doesn't fit into a checklist. It doesn't come from removing traits. It comes from understanding why they're there. The problem is, the ideal version of you has no history, no context, no limits. So every real reaction feels like failure by comparison. You start editing yourself mid-experience, holding back responses, second-guessing instincts, not because they're harmful, but because they don't match the image you're chasing. And the more you chase that image, the more distant it becomes. Because it was never meant to be reached. It exists to keep you striving, adjusting, correcting. And here's the trap. As long as you believe becoming someone better will finally give you peace, you'll keep postponing acceptance. You'll treat your current self as a temporary version, something to tolerate, not inhabit. And living that way creates a constant sense of instability. You're never fully here. You're always in transition. But growth doesn't happen in transition alone. It happens in contact. And the moment you stop chasing the idea of becoming someone else, you come face to face with the question most people avoid. What if nothing is missing? And what you're actually running from is yourself. So if chasing a better version of yourself doesn't bring peace, and correcting every reaction only creates more distance, then the obvious question is this: what was Jung actually pointing toward instead? Because he wasn't arguing against growth. He was arguing against war, especially the kind you wage internally. Jung's answer wasn't self-improvement, it was integration. And that word matters because it changes the direction completely. Integration doesn't ask, how do I get rid of this part of me? It asks, why is this part here at all? Instead of immediately correcting a reaction, you pause with it. Not to justify it, not to act it out, but to understand its role. That frustration you keep trying to control? It might be pointing to a boundary that's been crossed too many times. That hesitation you label as weakness. It might be awareness trying to slow you down before a costly decision. Jung put it this way: wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration of the contraries. In other words, growth isn't about removing inner conflict. It's about holding it long enough to learn from it. And this is where people get uneasy. Because integration doesn't give you quick wins. It doesn't give you dramatic before and after moments. It asks you to stay present with reactions you've trained yourself to immediately correct. Instead of saying, I shouldn't feel this way, you ask, what is this trying to tell me about my situation? That shift alone changes everything. Because once you stop treating parts of yourself as enemies, your energy stops being spent on control. You're no longer splitting yourself into acceptable and unacceptable sides. You're listening instead of supervising. This doesn't mean you act on every impulse. It means you don't silence information before you understand it. And something subtle happens when you do this consistently. You start responding instead of reacting. You make decisions with context, not pressure. You feel more stable, not because you're flawless, but because you're no longer divided. Jung believed that real change happens when opposing tendencies are allowed to coexist without one trying to erase the other. That's what creates depth. That's what creates clarity. And that's why integration feels slower than self-improvement, but lasts longer. Because it's not about becoming someone new. It's about becoming more fully who you already are. Now here's the part most people quietly avoid. Integration sounds reasonable in theory. But the moment you try to live it, something pushes back. Not from the outside, from inside. The first thing you notice when you stop fixing yourself is how exposed you feel. There's no immediate action to hide behind, no technique to apply, no quick correction to make the feeling go away. Just the experience itself. And that feels wrong at first, because you've been trained to believe that discomfort means something needs to be changed immediately. So when you pause instead of correcting, your mind gets restless. You start wondering if you're being passive, if you're falling behind, if you're wasting time by not optimizing the moment. But this is the discomfort you can't skip. Jung said it plainly. There is no coming to consciousness without pain. That pain isn't dramatic. It's quiet. It's the unease of noticing a reaction without judging it. The tension of not rushing to label yourself as right or wrong. And this is where real growth either happens or doesn't. Because staying with discomfort feels like standing still. There's no visible progress, no checklist item to complete. But internally, something important is happening. You're breaking the reflex to escape. Instead of immediately changing how you feel, You're allowing yourself to register what's actually going on. That anxiety you usually try to fix, it becomes information. That irritation you normally suppress, it becomes a signal, not something to obey, but something to understand. This is harder than self-improvement, because self-improvement gives you movement. Discomfort asks for presence, and presence doesn't flatter the ego. You don't feel productive. You don't feel in control. You feel human. And that's why so many people quit at this stage. They mistake stillness for stagnation. They assume nothing is happening because nothing is being corrected. But this is where integration takes root. When you stop trying to escape discomfort, it loses some of its grip. Not because it disappears, but because it no longer needs to shout to be noticed. And slowly, your reactions begin to change. Not through force, not through rules, but through understanding. And once you experience that shift, it becomes clear why shortcuts don't work. Because anything that promises growth without discomfort is really just offering distraction. And that brings us to the final question. What happens when you stop running from yourself entirely? So after all of this, after the effort, the awareness, the constant pressure to become someone better, you're left with a quieter question. Not about how to improve, but about why you've been trying so hard to escape yourself in the first place. What if you were never broken? What if the parts of you you've been trying to fix were never mistakes, just messages you didn't know how to read yet? Most people spend years trying to outrun their reactions. They optimize their behavior. They manage their image. They correct themselves in real time. And they call that growth. But what if growth isn't about control at all? Carl Jung once said, "Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakes." And that line lands differently once you've seen the cost of constant self-correction. Because looking inside doesn't mean judging more carefully. It means listening more honestly. It means noticing when you're tense instead of immediately trying to relax. Recognizing frustration instead of masking it with positivity. Acknowledging hesitation instead of forcing confidence. Not to indulge these states, but to understand what they're responding to. Here's the real shift. When you stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking, "What is happening in me right now?" the internal battle softens. You're no longer split into the one who experiences and the one who constantly evaluates. You're just here. And from that place, decisions feel clearer. Boundaries feel more natural. Change feels less forced. Jung believed that the goal wasn't perfection, but wholeness. And wholeness doesn't come from fixing yourself into a better shape. It comes from allowing all parts of you to exist long enough to be understood. That doesn't make life easier overnight. It makes it real. And maybe that's the question worth sitting with. If you stopped trying to fix yourself, what would you finally have the space to hear? Because the moment you stop treating yourself like a problem to solve, you may realize something unexpected. You weren't stuck. You were just never listening. And once that clicks, self-improvement stops being the center of your life, and self-understanding quietly takes its place. So if you take anything from this, let it be this. You don't have to rush back into fixing yourself. There's no deadline for becoming someone else. No finish line where you suddenly earn the right to feel settled. The pressure you feel to constantly adjust, improve, and correct isn't proof that you're falling behind. It's proof that you've been carrying expectations that were never meant to be lived from. Carl Jung once said, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." But choosing doesn't always mean changing faster. Sometimes it means choosing not to fight what's already there. The moment you stop treating every reaction as a flaw, you create space for clarity instead of control. And clarity changes behavior naturally, without force, without self-punishment. You'll still grow, you'll still change. But it won't come from rejection. It will come from understanding.